On June 23, 1965, a Houston police officer opened a refrigerator on Driscoll Street and found something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. At first, he thought it was pork, neat cuts, carefully wrapped, stacked with precision. But then he saw the crisper drawer. Inside were two human heads, their faces frozen in eternal silence, staring up at him from beneath the frost. This is a true story. The victims were Fred and Edwina Rogers, an elderly couple who had lived quietly in Houston's Montrose neighborhood for over a decade. Their remains had been systematically dismembered, washed clean of blood, and stored like meat in their own kitchen. Every shelf was full, every space utilized. The precision was terrifying. And the person responsible, their own son, a brilliant, reclusive scientist named Charles Frederick Rogers, vanished that same week and has never been found. No body, no confession, no closure. Just an empty house, a locked door, and a refrigerator full of questions that 60 years later still have no answers. Welcome to the Midnight File. I'm Julian Cross, and tonight we're opening one of the most disturbing cases in American criminal history. A story of isolation, rage, and a disappearance so complete it feels like something out of a nightmare. This is the story of the Icebox Murders. Let me take you back to Houston, Texas, in the summer of 1965. The city was hot, humid, alive with the kind of energy that came from oil, money, and ambition. But tucked away in the Montrose area, on a quiet street called Driscoll, there stood a house that seemed to exist outside of time. Number 1815. A modest, single-story home with drawn blinds and a lawn that was just well kept enough not to draw complaints. The people who lived there were Fred and Edwina Rogers, an elderly couple in their 70s who had moved to the neighborhood about 10 years earlier. Neighbors described them as polite but distant. The kind of people who waved from the porch but never invited you in. They kept to themselves, Fred and Edwina, and in a city that was growing, changing, roaring into the future, they seemed content to remain still, invisible almost. But invisibility, as we'll see, can be dangerous, because when something terrible happens behind closed doors, no one hears the screams. Fred Rogers was in his mid-70s, a man who had lived through the Great Depression, through wars, through decades of American life that had hardened him in ways that don't always show on the surface. Those who knew him, and there weren't many, described him as stern, controlling, the kind of man who believed in discipline, in order, in the old ways of doing things. Edwina, his wife, was quieter, softer in appearance perhaps, but no less inscrutable. She kept the house, she managed the daily routines, and like her husband, she rarely ventured beyond the boundaries of their small, self-contained world. Together they lived a life that most people would describe as unremarkable, but unremarkable is often just another word for hidden, and hidden they were. Because what most neighbors didn't know, what most people who passed that house on Driscoll Street never suspected, was that Fred and Edwina were not alone. Living upstairs, in a bedroom that he had turned into something between a sanctuary and a prison, was their son, Charles Frederick Rogers, 43 years old, unmarried, unemployed, at least in any conventional sense, and by all accounts almost completely invisible to the outside world. Charles was a ghost in his own home. He cooked his meals on a hot plate in his bedroom. He communicated with his parents primarily through notes slipped under the door. He rarely came downstairs, and when he did, it was usually at night, when the rest of the house was dark and still. Neighbors later told police they didn't even know Fred and Edwina had a son. Some had lived on the street for years and never once saw him. And that kind of invisibility, that level of withdrawal from the world, it doesn't happen by accident. Something drives a person into that kind of isolation. Something breaks. But before we get to what broke, we need to understand who Charles Rogers was before the world forgot him. Because this was not a man without talent, not a man without potential. In fact, by all measurable standards, Charles Frederick Rogers should have been a success story. Born in 1921, he grew up in an era when intelligence and education could open doors that had been closed to previous generations. He attended Texas A&M briefly, then transferred to the University of Houston, where he earned a degree in nuclear physics, in the 1940s. This was not a field for dilettantes. This was cutting-edge science, the kind of knowledge that nations were building their futures on. After graduation, Charles served in the Navy, adding military discipline to his academic credentials. And when he returned to civilian life, he was hired by Shell Oil as a seismologist, a position that required both technical expertise and analytical precision. He worked for one of the most powerful corporations in Texas. He spoke multiple languages. He had pilot training. He was, by any reasonable measure, a man with options, a man with a future. And then, sometime in the late 1950s, he walked away from all of it. He left Shell Oil without explanation. He stopped engaging with the professional world. He retreated into that upstairs bedroom in his parents' house and, for all intents and purposes, disappeared from public life. What happened? What could drive a man with that kind of intellect, that kind of training, to choose isolation over achievement? The easy answer is mental illness. And perhaps that's part of it: depression, anxiety, some undiagnosed condition that made the world feel too loud, too demanding. But there's another answer, one that investigators would only begin to piece together after the discovery in the refrigerator, and that answer is far darker, because according to those who have studied this case most closely, forensic accountants Hugh and Martha Gardenier, who spent years reconstructing the financial and psychological dynamics of the Rogers household, Charles didn't retreat by choice. He was driven, systematically, deliberately, by the very people who should have protected him, his parents. If stories like this unsettle you, if you find yourself drawn to the darkest corners of human behavior, then subscribe to the Midnight File. Because the cases we examine here don't offer easy answers. They offer truth. And sometimes truth is the most disturbing thing of all. Let me paint you a picture of life inside 1815 Driscoll Street in the years leading up to June 1965. Imagine a house where 3 adults live under the same roof but barely speak, where communication happens through notes slipped under doors, where the only sounds are footsteps on stairs at odd hours and the hum of a hot plate cooking a solitary meal. This was not a home. It was a collection of separate, parallel existences held together by walls and shared history, but nothing resembling warmth. Charles lived upstairs. His parents lived downstairs. And between them was a silence so thick it must have felt like drowning. But silence, as we know, is never really empty. It's full of resentment, full of unspoken grievances, full of rage that has nowhere to go but inward, deeper and deeper, until it either consumes you or explodes. What the Gardeniers uncovered in their research was a pattern of abuse that stretched back decades. Physical abuse, emotional abuse, and eventually, financial abuse. According to their findings, Fred Rogers was a violent man. Not in the public sense. He was never arrested, never charged with anything, but within the walls of his home, he ruled with cruelty. Charles, they argue, was subjected to beatings, humiliation, and psychological torment throughout his childhood and even into adulthood. And Edwina, rather than intervening, enabled it. Perhaps she was a victim too. Perhaps she had long ago learned that survival meant compliance, or perhaps she was complicit in a more active sense. We'll never know for certain. What we do know is that by the time Charles was in his 40s, something else had been added to the equation. Money. Or more specifically, the theft of money. Because Charles, it turns out, owned property. The house on Driscoll Street was in his name. He had inherited land. He had assets. And according to the Gardeniers, Fred and Edwina had been systematically defrauding him, forging his signature on loans, taking out mortgages against his property, pocketing the proceeds while leaving him legally and financially exposed. Imagine that for a moment. You're a man in your 40s living in a house that you technically own, but you have no control over. Your parents, the people who raised you, who were supposed to care for you, are using your identity, your assets, as tools for their own gain. And you're powerless to stop it, because to confront them would mean exposing the decades of abuse, the isolation, the humiliation that you've endured in silence. So you stay upstairs, you cook on a hot plate. You slip notes under doors and you wait. For what? For an opportunity? For the rage to finally overflow? Or for something else? Something we'll never fully understand because the only person who knows is gone. But in June of 1965, the waiting ended. And what happened next was so methodical, so deliberate, so coldly executed, that it defies the usual narratives we tell ourselves about crimes of passion. The exact timeline of what occurred in that house will never be known with certainty, but investigators were able to piece together a rough sequence based on the condition of the bodies, the state of the crime scene, and the patterns they found. It likely began on a weekend in mid-June, a Saturday perhaps, or a Sunday, a day when the neighborhood was quiet, when people were inside their own homes, focused on their own lives. Fred and Edwina were downstairs. Charles was upstairs. And then something shifted. Maybe there was an argument. Maybe it was a note that went too far. Maybe it was nothing at all and just the final, inevitable collision of pressures that had been building for years. We know that Edwina was the first to go. She was shot. A single gunshot to the head. Quick, clinical, almost merciful compared to what came next. But Fred's end was different. He was beaten, repeatedly, with a claw hammer, the kind of blunt force trauma that speaks not to efficiency but to rage, to punishment, to the release of something that had been held back for so long it had turned into pure, unfiltered violence. The medical examiner later described the injuries as consistent with prolonged, brutal assault. This was not a single blow. This was not an accident. This was overkill. And overkill, in the language of criminal psychology, is personal. It's intimate. It's the mark of someone who didn't just want their victim gone. They wanted them to suffer. After both were gone, the real work began. And this is where the case takes on its uniquely disturbing character, because what happened next required time. It required planning. It required a level of detachment that is almost incomprehensible. The bodies were dragged to the bathroom. They were placed in the bathtub, and then methodically they were drained of blood. This alone would have taken hours. The human body holds roughly 5 liters of blood, and gravity does most of the work. But you still have to wait. You still have to watch. And during that time, there's nothing to do but think about what you've done, about what you're doing, about what comes next. Once the bodies were fully exsanguinated, the dismemberment began. Using tools found in the house, a saw, knives, possibly the same claw hammer that had ended Fred's life, the bodies were cut into pieces, not haphazardly, not in a frenzy, but carefully, deliberately. The cuts were described by investigators as fairly neat, suggesting someone who either had anatomical knowledge or simply took their time to ensure each piece was uniform, manageable. The pieces were then washed, scrubbed clean of blood, and one by one they were carried to the kitchen and placed in the refrigerator. Every shelf was utilized, every space filled. The crisper drawer at the bottom held the heads. The upper shelves held the limbs. The torso sections, the smaller fragments. It must have taken most of the night, maybe longer. And through it all the house remained dark. The blinds remained drawn. The doors remained locked. And when it was finished, when every piece was in its place, the refrigerator was closed, the lights were turned off. And whoever had done this walked out of 1815 Driscoll Street and vanished into the summer night. 4 days passed, maybe 5. It's hard to say exactly because no one was paying attention. Fred and Edwina Rogers were not the kind of people whose absence set off alarms. They didn't have jobs to miss. They didn't have social engagements. Their lives were so small, so contained, that it took nearly a week before anyone even noticed they were gone. But eventually a relative, accounts vary on exactly who, grew concerned. Phone calls went unanswered. The house remained dark, and on June 23, 1965, that relative contacted the Houston Police Department and requested a welfare check. 2 officers were dispatched to 1815 Driscoll Street. They knocked on the door. No answer. They knocked again. Louder this time, still nothing. The house had an eerie stillness to it, the kind that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up even before you know why. The officers made the decision to force entry. The door was locked from the inside, which required them to break it down. And once they were inside, they began a routine search. Living room, empty. Bedroom, empty. Bathroom clean, though there was a faint smell they couldn't quite place. And then they entered the kitchen. One of the officers opened the refrigerator. Later, he would say that his first thought was that the Rogers family had been storing pork. The meat was neatly arranged, wrapped in some places, stacked with care. It looked, at first glance, like someone had done a bulk shopping trip and was saving it for future meals. But then his eyes adjusted. He saw the color, the texture, and he saw the crisper drawer at the bottom. He opened it, and there, staring up at him through the frost and the plastic, were two human heads, severed, preserved. Their eyes closed, their expressions neutral, as if they had simply fallen asleep, and someone had decided to put them away for safekeeping. The officer backed away from the refrigerator. He radioed for backup, and within the hour, 1815 Driscoll Street was swarming with police, detectives, forensic technicians and reporters who had caught wind of something truly horrific unfolding in the Montrose neighborhood. The crime scene was like nothing Houston investigators had seen before. The refrigerator was full, not just of two bodies, but of carefully dismembered parts that had been washed, arranged and stored with a level of organization that suggested the perpetrator had taken their time. There was almost no blood visible in the house. The bathroom had been cleaned. The kitchen had been cleaned. Even the tools used in the dismemberment, a claw hammer, a saw, several knives, had been wiped down, though traces of blood were still detectable under forensic examination. This was not the work of someone in a frenzy. This was not the aftermath of a chaotic, unplanned event. This was methodical, controlled and deeply, deeply disturbing. The medical examiner arrived and began the grim task of cataloguing the remains. Fred and Edwina Rogers, both in their 70s, had been deceased for several days based on decomposition and the condition of the tissue. Edwina's cause of death, a gunshot wound to the head. Fred's cause of death, blunt force trauma consistent with repeated blows from a hammer. The dismemberment had been performed post-mortem, which was at least some small mercy. They had not been conscious during that final violation, but still, the question remained: who could do this? Who could take the time, the effort, the emotional energy required to not just end two lives, but to systematically erase them, reduce them to cuts of meat in their own refrigerator? The answer, investigators quickly realized, was likely someone who lived in the house. There was no forced entry. The doors and windows were locked from the inside. Nothing had been stolen. There were no signs of a struggle beyond the violence inflicted on Fred and Edwina themselves. This was, in all likelihood, a family matter, and that's when they learned about Charles Frederick Rogers, the son who lived upstairs, the man who had been invisible to the neighborhood for years, the ghost in the house, and just like his parents, he was gone. His bedroom was empty, his belongings were still there, clothes, books, personal items, but Charles himself had vanished. And when investigators examined his room more closely, they found something that chilled them even more than the contents of the refrigerator. Blood, traces of it, in the keyhole of his bedroom door. Despite the extensive cleaning throughout the rest of the house, despite the meticulous effort to remove evidence, there were drops of blood around Charles's door, which meant he had been there, in the house, during or immediately after the events. And then he had left, and he had never come back. If you're feeling the weight of this story, if it's pulling you into the same dark questions that have haunted investigators for decades, then leave a comment below. Tell me what you think happened. Tell me what you would have done if you had been the officer opening that refrigerator. Because the truth is, cases like this don't just ask us to understand what happened. They ask us to confront what we're capable of understanding, and sometimes the answer is not enough. A manhunt began almost immediately. Charles Frederick Rogers became the primary and really the only suspect in what the press had already started calling the Icebox Murders. Descriptions went out across Texas, then across the country. 43 years old, 5 feet 7 inches tall, approximately 140 pounds, thinning dark hair, last seen wearing, well, no one could say for certain because no one had seen him in weeks, maybe months. His photograph was circulated, airports were alerted, border crossings were monitored, and investigators began digging into Charles's life, trying to understand who this man was and where he might have gone. What they found was a portrait of someone who should have been easy to track. Charles had a degree in nuclear physics. He spoke multiple languages, Spanish, possibly some German, depending on which accounts you believe. He had pilot training from his time in the Navy. He had worked for Shell Oil, one of the most powerful corporations in the world. This was not a man without resources, not a man without skills, and yet he had chosen to live as a recluse, locked in a bedroom, communicating with notes, cooking on a hot plate. Why? The more investigators dug, the stranger the picture became. Charles, they learned, actually owned the house at 1815 Driscoll Street. It was in his name, not his parents'. He also owned other parcels of land, property that should have made him at least moderately wealthy. But none of that wealth was visible in his lifestyle. He didn't drive a car. He didn't have a job. He didn't seem to have any income beyond whatever assets he might have quietly liquidated over the years. And that's when the financial irregularities started to surface. Loans had been taken out against Charles's property. Mortgages had been signed. Documents bore his signature, or what appeared to be his signature. But Charles, according to those who later analyzed the records, had not authorized these transactions. His parents had. Fred and Edwina had been using their son's assets, his identity, his legal ownership to extract money. And Charles, for reasons that remain unclear, had allowed it to happen. Or perhaps he hadn't known. Perhaps the isolation was so complete that he had lost track of what was being done in his name. This is where the Gardeniers' research becomes crucial. Hugh and Martha Gardenier, the forensic accountants I mentioned earlier, spent years reconstructing the financial dynamics of the Rogers household. They pored over property records, loan documents, signatures. They interviewed people who had known the family, and what they concluded was this. Charles Rogers was not just a recluse, he was a victim of lifelong abuse, both physical and financial. A victim of parents who had systematically controlled, exploited, and humiliated him for decades. And in June of 1965, something snapped. The Gardeniers argue that the events of that weekend were not random. They were not the result of sudden madness. They were the culmination of a lifetime of rage that had been suppressed, internalized, and finally unleashed with a precision that only someone as intelligent and methodical as Charles could achieve. Fred was beaten to death. Overkill, punishment, revenge for years of abuse. Edwina was shot, quicker, perhaps more merciful, but still eliminated because she was complicit, because she had enabled what Fred had done. And then came the dismemberment. Why? Why go to such lengths? Why not just leave the bodies and flee? The Gardeniers suggest it was about control. Charles had spent his entire life being controlled, by his parents, by his circumstances, by the isolation that had been forced upon him. And in those hours after the violence, as he drained their blood, as he cut them into pieces, as he washed and arranged them in the refrigerator, he was finally the one in control. He was the one making the decisions. He was the one reducing them to nothing. It's a chilling theory, but it's also one that fits the evidence better than any alternative. Because the alternative is to believe that this level of methodical violence came from nowhere, that a man with no history of outward aggression, no criminal record, no documented conflicts with anyone outside his immediate family, suddenly committed one of the most grotesque crimes in Texas history for no reason at all, and that just doesn't make sense. So where did Charles go? That's the question that has haunted this case for nearly 60 years. He left the house on Driscoll Street sometime in mid-June 1965, and from that moment on, he was never seen again. Not by police, not by family, not by anyone who could confirm his identity with certainty. The Gardeniers believe he fled to Mexico, then deeper into Central or South America, where he lived under an assumed identity until his death, likely sometime in the 1970s or early 1980s. They base this on financial traces, property transfers, liquidations of assets, that suggest Charles had access to money and used it to disappear. They also point to his skills. He spoke Spanish. He had navigation and piloting experience. He was intelligent enough to create a new identity in an era before digital records made that nearly impossible. If anyone could vanish, it was Charles Frederick Rogers. But here's the problem. There's no proof, no confirmed sightings, no documentation, no paper trail that definitively places Charles anywhere after June 1965. And that absence of evidence has allowed the case to grow into something larger than itself, something mythological. Because when a suspect vanishes so completely, people start to fill in the gaps. They start to imagine where he went, what he did, who he became. And some of those imaginings are far more elaborate than a simple flight to Mexico. This is where the conspiracy theories enter the picture. And the biggest, most persistent theory is the one that connects Charles Rogers to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Yes, you heard that correctly. There are people who believe that Charles Frederick Rogers, reclusive, unemployed, living in his parents' house, was actually a CIA operative or contract assassin who played a role in the events of November 22, 1963, in Dallas. The theory goes something like this. Charles's work as a seismologist for Shell Oil brought him into contact with powerful figures in the oil industry. These figures had connections to intelligence agencies. Charles, with his technical skills and languages, was recruited into covert operations. He was in Dallas. He was one of the shooters, or at least someone with knowledge of the conspiracy. And when his parents found out, or threatened to expose him, he eliminated them to protect the secret. It's a compelling narrative. It has all the elements of a great thriller. But here's the thing. There's no evidence. None. Not a single document places Charles Rogers in Dallas on November 22, 1963. Not a single credible witness has identified him as being involved in any aspect of the assassination. The connections to the CIA, to oil industry conspiracies, to shadowy government operations, all of it is speculative, built on circumstantial associations and the kind of pattern-seeking that humans are so good at when faced with unsolved mysteries. Don't get me wrong. I'm not dismissing the possibility of hidden layers in this case. I'm not saying that Charles's life was exactly as it appeared. But the JFK angle is at best a distraction. It's a way of making the story bigger, more dramatic, more connected to the grand narratives of American history. And in doing so, it risks overshadowing the much simpler, much more tragic truth that Charles Rogers was a man destroyed by his own family, who responded with violence and then disappeared into the vast anonymity of the world. That's the story, that's what we know, and sometimes the truth is smaller than the myth, but no less haunting. In 1975, 10 years after he vanished, Charles Frederick Rogers was declared legally dead. The state of Texas needed closure, needed to resolve his legal status, his property holdings, his debts. And since there had been no credible sightings, no contact, no indication that he was alive anywhere in the world, the courts made the only decision they could. But a legal declaration of death is not the same as a body. It's not the same as proof. And so the case remains officially unsolved. Not because investigators don't have a suspect. They do. Charles Rogers is the only person who makes sense, but because there was never an arrest, never a trial, never a confession. And in the American legal system, that means no resolution. Just a file that sits in a cabinet somewhere in Houston, gathering dust, waiting for evidence that will almost certainly never come. Over the years, journalists have revisited the case. Documentaries have been made. Podcasts have dissected the details. And each time the same questions resurface. What really happened in that house? What drove Charles to do what he did? And where is he now? Is he buried in some unmarked grave in Mexico? Did he die alone, haunted by what he had done? Or did he live out his years in quiet anonymity, perhaps even finding some measure of peace in a new life, a new identity, far from the refrigerator on Driscoll Street? We'll never know, and maybe that's the point. Maybe the absence of answers is what keeps this case alive. Because in the absence of truth, we fill the void with imagination, with theories, with stories that try to make sense of the senseless. But here's what we do know. On June 23, 1965, 2 people were found dismembered and stored in their own refrigerator. Their son, the only person with motive, means, and opportunity, vanished and was never seen again. And somewhere in that sequence of events is a tragedy so profound, so intimate, so completely hidden from the world, that even now, 6 decades later, we're still trying to understand it. If cases like this fascinate you, if you find yourself drawn to the mysteries that refuse to be solved, then share this video with someone who feels the same. because stories like this need to be told. Not to glorify the violence, not to sensationalize the horror, but to remember, to bear witness, to acknowledge that these things happened and that the people involved, victims and perpetrator alike, were real. Let's talk about the refrigerator itself for a moment, because it's become the symbol of this case, the Icebox Murders. The name conjures an image that's impossible to shake. 2 human heads in a crisper drawer, body parts neatly stacked like groceries. It's grotesque, it's horrifying, and it's also deeply strange. Because refrigerators are domestic objects, they're about preservation, about planning for the future, about making sure you have enough food to get through the week, and to use one as a tomb, to take something so mundane, so tied to the rhythms of daily life, and turn it into a repository for death. That's a violation of a very primal kind. It's not just the act of ending life, it's the act of erasing it, of reducing human beings to anonymous flesh, stored and forgotten. Some have speculated that the refrigerator was chosen for practical reasons. It kept the bodies cold, slowed decomposition, reduced the smell, and that's probably part of it. But I think it's more than that. I think the refrigerator was a statement, a final act of control. Charles, if we accept that he was the one who did this, had lived his entire life in that house under the control of others, and in the end he turned the tables, he made his parents into objects, into things that could be stored, arranged, managed. It's a deeply psychological act, and it suggests that whoever did this was not just angry. They were making a point. They were rewriting the power dynamic in the most permanent, most irreversible way possible. And then they walked away, leaving the refrigerator as a kind of monument, a testament to what happens when control is taken to its absolute, terrifying extreme. I want to take a moment to address the victims in this case, because in stories like this, it's easy to lose sight of Fred and Edwina as people. They become symbols, the abusive parents, the financial fraudsters, the bodies in the refrigerator. But they were real. They had lives before that house on Driscoll Street. They had histories, relationships, moments of joy and sorrow that we'll never know about. And while the evidence suggests they may have been responsible for terrible things, abuse, exploitation, cruelty, we also have to acknowledge that we're seeing them through the lens of a single narrative. The Gardenier's research, the theories of investigators, the assumptions we make based on the violence that was inflicted upon them. We don't have Fred and Edwina's side of the story. We never will, and that's part of the tragedy too, because in the end, whatever wrongs they may have committed, they were reduced to pieces in a refrigerator. They were denied dignity, autonomy, even the basic recognition of their humanity. And no one deserves that. No one. At the same time, we can't ignore the possibility, the likelihood, even, that Charles was a victim long before he became a perpetrator, that the violence he inflicted was the echo of violence inflicted upon him, that the isolation he chose or had forced upon him was a kind of slow death that eventually demanded an answer. None of this excuses what happened. It doesn't make the dismemberment any less horrifying, but it does complicate the narrative. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about culpability, about justice, about how we assign blame when the line between victim and offender is blurred beyond recognition. And those questions don't have easy answers. They never do. Let me take you back to the crime scene one more time, because there are details here that reveal something about the person who did this. The house was clean, almost spotless. Despite the massive amount of blood that must have been present during the initial violence and the dismemberment, investigators found very little visible trace. The bathroom had been scrubbed. The kitchen had been wiped down. The tools had been cleaned. This level of attention to detail suggests someone who was not panicking, someone who had the presence of mind to plan, to think ahead, to cover their tracks. But here's the interesting thing, they didn't do a perfect job. There was blood in Charles's bedroom doorframe, blood in the keyhole, traces that a forensic team could find even decades later. So was this incompetence, a small oversight in an otherwise meticulous plan? Or was it something else? Was it perhaps intentional? A way of leaving a signature, a clue that said, yes, I was here, yes, I did this, and now I'm gone. I don't have an answer to that question, But it's worth considering, because the psychology of someone who commits this kind of act is never simple. It's never just about rage or just about planning. It's a mixture of impulses that we, looking from the outside, can only guess at. And the fact that Charles, if it was Charles, left those traces suggests that maybe, on some level, he wanted to be found. Or at least he wanted someone to know, to understand, to see what had been done to him and what he had done in return. It's a kind of communication, a message in blood left for whoever cared enough to look. And 60 years later, we're still looking, still trying to decode what it means. The neighborhood in the days after the discovery was in shock. Driscoll Street had always been quiet, the kind of place where people kept to themselves, where you could live for years and never really know your neighbors. But suddenly everyone was paying attention. Reporters camped out on the sidewalk, police cars blocked the street, and the house at 1815 became a spectacle, a grotesque landmark. People who had walked past it 1,000 times without a second thought now stared at it with horror, trying to reconcile the banality of the structure, the modest porch, the drawn blinds, with the nightmare that had unfolded inside. How had no one known? How had no one seen anything? The answer, of course, is that Fred and Edwina and Charles had been invisible by design. They had cultivated a life that required no outside contact, and in doing so, they had created the perfect conditions for something terrible to happen unseen. It's a lesson, if there is one to be drawn from this case, about the danger of isolation, about what happens when people retreat so far from the world that no one is watching. No one is checking in. No one is asking if everything is okay, because it wasn't okay, not for years. And by the time anyone realized it, it was far too late. The damage was done, the bodies were in the refrigerator, and the person responsible was gone. And what haunts me about this case, what keeps me coming back to it, is the silence. The years of silence that preceded the violence. The silence of a man living in a bedroom, cooking on a hot plate, slipping notes under a door. The silence of parents who never spoke about their son to the neighbors. The silence of a house where 3 people lived, but no one really lived at all. And then, in a single weekend, that silence erupted into something so loud, so visceral, that it echoes even now. Forensic accountants Hugh and Martha Gardenier have spent more time with this case than perhaps anyone else alive. Their book, their website, their years of research, all of it points to a singular conclusion. Charles Rogers was systematically abused and exploited by his parents, and the events of June 1965 were not random violence, but a calculated response to decades of torment. They've traced property records showing how Fred and Edwina used Charles's assets. They've documented patterns of control that extended far beyond the financial, and they've constructed a narrative in which Charles is not a monster, but a victim who finally struck back. It's a compelling argument, and in many ways it's the most complete explanation we have for why this happened. But it's also, we must remember, an interpretation, a reconstruction based on documents and patterns and educated guesses. We don't have Charles's testimony. We don't have a confession. We don't have the internal thoughts that led him from a bedroom in Houston to wherever he ended up. What we have is evidence of suffering, evidence of exploitation, evidence of a family dynamic so toxic that it eventually produced one of the most disturbing crime scenes in American history. And whether you view Charles as a victim or a perpetrator, or more accurately as both, depends on how much weight you give to the context, to the years that preceded the violence, to the invisible scars that no autopsy could ever document. The Gardeniers argue that if Charles is ever found, if he's somehow still alive or if his remains are discovered, he should be treated with compassion, not absolved of responsibility, but understood as someone who was broken long before he broke others. And I think there's truth in that. Not a comfortable truth, not one that makes us feel better about what happened, but a truth nonetheless. Because monsters aren't born, they're made, and the making often happens in places we never see, in houses with drawn blinds, in bedrooms with notes slipped under doors, in silences that stretch for years until they can't be contained anymore. Now let's address the question that's probably been on your mind since the beginning of this story. Could Charles Rogers still be alive? Technically, yes. He would be over 100 years old, but it's not impossible. People live that long, but practically, Almost certainly not. The Gardeniers believe he died sometime between the 1970s and early 1980s, likely in Latin America, under a name we'll never know. And given the complete absence of any credible sightings, any documentation, any evidence of his continued existence, that seems like the most reasonable conclusion. But here's the thing about unsolved cases. The absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. And as long as there's no body, no definitive proof of death, the possibility remains. It's remote. It's unlikely. But it's there. And that possibility is part of what keeps this case alive in the public imagination. The idea that somewhere, maybe, Charles Rogers is still out there, an old man with secrets that would rewrite everything we think we know. It's a tantalizing thought, but it's also probably a fantasy. The truth, I suspect, is far more mundane. Charles fled. He lived for a while under a false identity, and then he died, as all people do, and was buried somewhere without a marker, without a name that would connect him to Driscoll Street. The world forgot him, just as he had tried to forget the world. But even if Charles is gone, the questions remain. And those questions are what I want to leave you with. Not as answers, not as neat conclusions, but as invitations to think deeper about this case and others like it. What do we owe to victims of abuse who become perpetrators themselves? How do we balance empathy with accountability? And what does it mean to truly vanish in a world that seems increasingly interconnected, increasingly surveilled? Because Charles Rogers did it. He walked out of Houston in 1965 and was never found. And whether that speaks to his intelligence, his planning, or simply the limitations of law enforcement at the time, it's a reminder that even in our modern world, it's still possible to disappear. If you know how, if you have the skills, if you're willing to leave everything behind and never look back. Before we move toward the end of this story, I want to talk about the refrigerator one more time, because it's not just a crime scene detail. It's a symbol, and symbols matter. When we talk about the Icebox Murders, we're not just talking about what happened to Fred and Edwina Rogers. We're talking about the way violence can be domesticated, made orderly, stored away like leftovers. And there's something uniquely modern about that, something that speaks to our era of compartmentalization, of putting things in boxes, literal and metaphorical, so we don't have to deal with them. The refrigerator was, in a way, the perfect final resting place for a family that had spent years compartmentalizing their dysfunction. Fred in his anger, Edwina in her complicity, Charles in his bedroom, each in their own separate space, never confronting the reality of what was happening between them. And in the end, that compartmentalization became literal. Bodies in a box. Neat, organized, hidden, until someone opened the door. If this story has affected you, if it's made you think about the hidden violence in ordinary places, then hit that like button. Not because I'm asking for engagement for its own sake, but because it tells me that stories like this matter to you, that you're willing to sit with discomfort, to ask hard questions, to not look away, and that's what the Midnight File is all about. We don't shy away from the darkness. We walk into it, together. So if you're with me on that, let me know. Leave a like. Leave a comment. Tell me what you think happened in that house, because your perspective matters. Your voice is part of how we make sense of these mysteries. Let me tell you what happened after the bodies were found, after the police processed the scene, after the coroner took the remains away, after the reporters moved on to the next story. The house at 1815 Driscoll Street stood empty for years. No one wanted to live there. No one wanted to own property associated with something so grotesque, and I can't blame them. Because houses remember. They hold the echoes of what happened inside them, and some echoes are too loud to live with. Eventually, the property was sold. New owners moved in, the house was renovated, repainted, cleaned of every trace of what had occurred in June 1965. But you can't renovate memory. You can't paint over history. And to this day, if you know where to look, if you know what happened, that house carries a weight that no amount of cosmetic change can erase. I mention this because I think it's important to remember that crimes don't just affect the people directly involved. They ripple outward. They touch the neighbors who have to live with the knowledge that something terrible happened next door. They touch the police officers who opened that refrigerator and can never unsee what they saw. They touch the community, which has to reconcile its image of itself as a safe, normal place with the reality that sometimes the most horrific things happen in the most ordinary settings. And they touch us even now, 60 years later, as we try to make sense of what happened and why. That's the power of true crime. It's not just entertainment. It's not just a puzzle to solve. It's a window into the darkest corners of human nature. And once you look through that window, you can't unknow what you've seen. There's a theory I want to mention, even though it's speculative, because it speaks to something important about how we understand this case. Some have suggested that Charles didn't act alone, that there was someone else involved, a friend, an accomplice, someone who helped with the planning or the execution or the disposal. The evidence for this is thin, almost non-existent, but the theory persists because people have a hard time believing that one person, acting alone, could be so methodical, so calm, so thorough. Surely the thinking goes, it would take multiple people to drain 2 bodies, dismember them, clean the scene, and arrange everything so carefully. But here's the thing. It wouldn't. It would just take time. And whoever did this had all the time in the world. The house was isolated. The neighbors weren't paying attention. And once Fred and Edwina were gone, there was no one to interrupt, no one to rush the process. So while the idea of an accomplice is intriguing, it's probably unnecessary. One person could have done this. One person with the right combination of intelligence, rage, and detachment. And if that person was Charles Rogers, then he didn't need help. He just needed a reason. And after 43 years of living in that house, he had plenty of reasons. I want to read you something. It's a quote from one of the officers who was at the scene that day in June 1965. He said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that what struck him most wasn't the violence. It wasn't even the dismemberment. It was the cleanliness, the order, the way everything had been arranged so carefully, as if the person responsible wanted to make sure it was done right, as if they took pride in the work. And that, he said, was what haunted him, because it suggested that whoever did this didn't just commit an act of violence. They committed an act of care, twisted care, horrible care, but care nonetheless. And that's what makes this case so difficult to process, because we want our criminals to be chaotic. We want them to be sloppy, impulsive, easy to catch. It makes us feel safer. But Charles Rogers, if it was Charles, was none of those things. He was careful, he was patient, he was thorough. And in being those things, he showed us something we don't want to see, that the people who do the worst things are not always the ones we expect. Sometimes they're quiet, invisible, living upstairs in a house we pass every day without a second thought. Let's talk about the tools for a moment. The claw hammer, the knives, the saw, all found in the house, all likely belonging to the Rogers family. There's something particularly chilling about this, because it means the person who did this didn't need to bring weapons. They didn't need to plan in advance to acquire tools. They just used what was there, what was available, and that speaks again to someone who was acting within their own space, someone who knew where everything was, who had access to the garage, the kitchen, the bathroom, someone who lived there. The hammer in particular is significant. It was used to end Fred's life, multiple blows. The kind of sustained attack that requires strength, yes, but also commitment. You have to keep going. You have to overcome the natural human reluctance to continue inflicting violence once your target is down. And that's not easy. It's one of the reasons why crimes of this nature are relatively rare. Because most people, even in moments of extreme rage, can't sustain that level of violence. But whoever did this could, and did, until Fred Rogers was no longer recognizable as the man who had perhaps made his son's life unbearable for decades. Now I want to address something that might be uncomfortable, and that's the question of whether Charles Rogers, if he did this, should be considered a victim or a perpetrator. Or both, because I think the answer is both. And I think our legal system, our moral framework, our cultural narratives about crime and punishment often struggle with cases like this, because we want clean categories, we want villains and heroes, we want to know who to sympathize with and who to condemn. But life doesn't work that way, people don't work that way. Charles Rogers, by all accounts, was subjected to terrible things: physical abuse, emotional manipulation, financial exploitation, things that would break most people, and they did break him. But what he did in response was also terrible. There's no getting around that. He ended 2 lives. He dismembered 2 bodies. He left a scene that traumatized everyone who encountered it. Those are facts, and they can't be erased by context, no matter how sympathetic. So where does that leave us? I think it leaves us with the uncomfortable truth that human beings are capable of immense suffering and immense cruelty, sometimes within the same person. That abuse creates cycles, that victims can become perpetrators without ceasing to be victims, and that our responsibility as people trying to understand these stories is not to pick a side. It's to hold all of it, to acknowledge the complexity, to sit with the discomfort, because the moment we simplify, the moment we reduce this to a neat narrative of good and evil, we lose something essential. We lose the truth, and the truth in this case is messy. It's contradictory, it's painful, but it's real. And real is what we owe to everyone involved. To Fred and Edwina, who suffered horrific ends. To Charles, who may have suffered horrific beginnings. To the officers who opened that refrigerator. To the community that had to reckon with what happened. To all of us, still trying to understand. One more thing I want to mention before we close, and that's the role of memory in cases like this, because what we remember, and how we remember it, shapes how we understand history. The Icebox murders are remembered, obviously, for the refrigerator, for the gruesome discovery, for the shock value, and in some ways that's inevitable. That's human nature. We remember the extreme, the unusual, the things that jolt us out of our everyday assumptions, but what we often forget are the years of quiet suffering that preceded that moment. The decades of isolation, the slow accumulation of grievances, the invisible wounds that no one saw because no one was looking. And I think that's a loss, because if we only remember the spectacle, we miss the warning signs. We miss the lessons that might help us prevent the next tragedy. So when you think about this case, when you remember it, I encourage you to remember all of it, not just the refrigerator, but the house, the silence, the man in the upstairs bedroom who no one saw. Because that's where it started. That's where the seeds of violence were planted, and that's where we might have intervened, if we'd known, if we'd been paying attention, if we'd cared enough to ask uncomfortable questions. If you've made it this far in the video, you're part of a rare group. Someone who doesn't just want quick answers or easy thrills. Someone who's willing to sit with complexity, and I appreciate that. So do me a favor, share this video with someone who thinks the same way. Someone who values depth over sensationalism. Someone who wants to understand, not just consume. Because the Midnight File exists for people like you, and the more we can grow this community, the more stories we can tell, the more questions we can ask, the more darkness we can illuminate even if we can't always explain it. I want to take you back to 1965 one more time. To the neighborhood, to the street, to the people who lived near 1815 Driscoll. Because there's something haunting about the fact that for days, maybe a week, the bodies were in that refrigerator while life went on around them. People walked their dogs past the house, children played in nearby yards, the mailman delivered letters, and inside, behind those drawn blinds, were the remains of 2 people who would never receive another letter, never hear another footstep, never see another sunrise. It's a profound disconnection. The boundary between normalcy and horror is often paper-thin. A door, a wall, a refrigerator door, and we walk past it every day without knowing. That's what this case teaches us, if it teaches us anything. That the worst things can happen in the most ordinary places, and we'll never know until someone opens the door. But there's another lesson here too, and it's about attention, about noticing, about being present in our communities, in our neighborhoods, in our own families, because the Rogers family wasn't okay, and people sensed it. Neighbors described the house as strange, as off. But no one acted on that feeling. No one knocked on the door and asked if everything was all right. And maybe that wouldn't have changed anything. Maybe by 1965 it was already too late. But maybe not. Maybe if someone had reached out, if someone had offered Charles an alternative to the isolation he was living in, if someone had asked Fred and Edwina if they needed help, maybe the trajectory could have shifted. It's impossible to know. but it's worth thinking about. Because there are people living in isolation right now, people trapped in toxic dynamics, people reaching the end of their ability to cope. And if we pay attention, if we act on those instincts that tell us something isn't right, maybe we can intervene before it's too late. That's not a guarantee, it's not a promise, but it's a possibility. And in cases like this, possibilities are all we have. As we approach the end of this story, I want to acknowledge something. This has been a hard story to tell, and I imagine it's been a hard story to hear. Because there's no comfort in it, no resolution, no moment where we can say, "Ah, now I understand." What we have instead is a collection of facts that add up to something deeply disturbing and deeply sad. 2 people are gone. Their son is gone. The house stands empty of its original occupants, and the only thing that remains is the story we tell ourselves to try to make sense of what happened. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the act of telling, of remembering, of not looking away. Maybe that's the only justice we can offer now, 60 years later. Not legal justice. That ship sailed when Charles Rogers vanished. But moral justice. The justice of bearing witness, of saying this happened, these people existed, and what was done to them, and what they may have done to each other, matters. So let me bring this to a close. Let me offer you the conclusion that Julian Cross would give if he were sitting across from you, in a room lit only by a desk lamp, with the weight of this story hanging in the air between you. Here it is. The Icebox Murders are not a mystery in the traditional sense. We know what happened, at least in broad strokes. We know who the victims were. We have a very strong idea of who was responsible. What we don't know, or what we can never know, is why. Not the surface why, not the immediate why, but the deep why. The why that reaches back through decades of family dysfunction, abuse, exploitation, and suffering. The why that asks, what turns a human being into someone capable of such methodical violence? And the answer, I think, is that there is no single why. There's 1,000 small whys, 1,000 moments of pain, of humiliation, of rage that was swallowed and suppressed until it couldn't be contained anymore. And when it finally broke through completely. Charles Frederick Rogers, wherever he is now, alive or dead, in this world or beyond it, took those answers with him. And we're left with the questions, with the refrigerator, with the empty bedroom, with the notes slipped under a door that no one will ever read again. And maybe that's the most terrifying part of all. Not the violence itself, but the silence that surrounds it. The absence of explanation, the void where understanding should be. Because we want to believe that if we can understand something, we can prevent it, we can see it coming, we can intervene. But sometimes the signs are invisible. Sometimes the suffering happens behind closed doors, in locked bedrooms, in the spaces between words that were never spoken, and by the time we realize something is wrong, it's already over. The bodies are in the refrigerator. The perpetrator is gone. And all we can do is try to piece together what happened and hope that somehow the act of remembering is enough. Every town keeps a secret. Some just bury it deeper than others. Houston buried the Rogers family twice, once in the refrigerator, where their remains were discovered in a configuration that still defies comprehension, and once in memory, as the case faded from headlines, from public consciousness, from everything except the archives and the minds of those who can't let it go. But some stories refuse to stay buried. Some stories claw their way back to the surface, demanding to be heard, demanding to be understood, even when understanding feels impossible. The Icebox Murders are one of those stories. They're a reminder that beneath the surface of every community, every neighborhood, every family, there are currents we can't see, tensions we don't recognize. And sometimes those currents converge in ways that produce something unthinkable. If stories like this stay with you, if they keep you up at night, turning over possibilities, asking questions that have no answers, then subscribe to the Midnight File. Because there are more stories to tell, more files to open, more darkness to illuminate, even when the light doesn't bring comfort. And if you're someone who values truth over easy answers, depth over sensation, then you belong here, with me. In this space where we ask hard questions and sit with uncomfortable truths. So, subscribe. Leave a comment telling me what you think happened in that house on Driscoll Street. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, because stories like this aren't just about the past. They're about right now. They're about the invisible suffering happening in houses we pass every day. And the more we talk about it, the more we acknowledge it, the better chance we have of seeing it before it's too late. This is Julian Cross, closing another file. But before I do, I want to leave you with one final thought, one final image. It's the refrigerator door, closing for the last time in June 1965, the click of the seal, the darkness inside, the cold, and somewhere, walking out of that house, is a man who has just crossed a line that can never be uncrossed. He's carrying nothing, leaving everything behind. And in a few moments he'll step out into the Houston night and disappear into history. Where did he go? What did he feel in that moment? Was it relief? Terror? Emptiness? We'll never know. And maybe we're not supposed to. Maybe some things are meant to remain in the dark, behind closed doors, sealed away like the contents of that refrigerator. But the fact that we don't know doesn't mean we stop asking. It doesn't mean we stop looking. Because the moment we stop asking questions, the moment we accept the silence, is the moment we surrender to the darkness. And I'm not ready to do that. Are you? The midnight file closes, but the questions remain, as they always do, as they always will. Until next time, remember, every house has a story, every door hides something, and sometimes what's hidden is more terrible than anything we could imagine. But we look anyway, because someone has to, because the truth, no matter how dark, is always worth seeking, even when it hides in refrigerators, even when it vanishes without a trace, even when all we're left with is questions that echo in empty rooms and a story that refuses to end. Good night, and sleep well, if you can.